They were an overgrown eyesore, Mr. Thompson. We did you a favor. The words hung in the unnaturally bright air, thin and sharp as shattered glass, spoken by a woman whose very posture screamed a grotesque fusion of entitlement and authority. Her name was Karen Miller, the president of the Homeowners Association, and she stood on the edge of my property line with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, a smug little smile playing on her lips. Behind her, the scene was one of pure carnage, where a proud 100-year-old stand of mature oak and maple trees had stood just that morning, a buffer of green that had been the single most important reason I bought this 5-acre plot. There was now nothing but a brutal expanse of churned mud, sawdust, and the raw, pale stumps of murdered giants. The air, which should have smelled of pine needles and damp earth, was thick with the acrid stench of chain oil and the funereal perfume of fresh-cut wood. My heart, a steady drum that had beaten through 3 tours as an Army combat engineer, was hammering against my ribs with a force that felt like it might crack them. I had been gone for less than 6 hours, a simple trip into town for supplies, and I had returned to a war zone declared on my own land. 48 trees, some of them saplings when my grandfather was a boy, were gone. They weren't just trees. They were a living wall, a sanctuary, the very soul of this place I had chosen to be my final posting after a life of service. They were a promise I had made to my late wife, Sarah, that I would find a piece of the world that still felt wild and quiet, a place where our grandchildren could one day climb and scrape their knees and feel connected to something bigger than a subdivision. And now they were mulch. Karen, in her pastel pink tracksuit that seemed to mock the surrounding destruction, took a triumphant step forward, her sneakers sinking slightly into the violated soil. "And here," she said, detaching a piece of paper from her clipboard with a flourish, "is the invoice for the removal service, plus the standard fine for violating Article 7, Section 4 of the Community Bylaws regarding unkempt landscaping. Total is $3,500, due in 15 days or we start accruing late fees." My hands clenched into fists at my sides, the knuckles white. I could feel the discipline of 1,000 drills, 1,000 moments of high-stress decision-making, screaming at me to maintain control. I looked from the obscene bill in her hand to the field of stumps, each one a fresh, open wound on the landscape. I could see the deep tracks of the heavy machinery they must have used, a reckless gouge that ran from the street right up to the edge of my lawn, heedless of property lines or the delicate ecosystem they were obliterating. The sheer speed and audacity of it were breathtaking. This wasn't a warning, it was an execution. It was a power play of such shocking arrogance that it almost defied belief. My voice, when it finally came, was low and dangerously calm. "You came onto my private property without my permission and destroyed nearly $1 million worth of mature timber, and you're handing me a bill?" Karen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing. "Don't be ridiculous, Mr. Thompson. $1 million? They were just messy trees, and the board approved the action unanimously. Your property is the gateway to the entire Bluffs neighborhood, and your little private forest was becoming a blight. It blocked the view and was a haven for pests." She said, "Your little private forest," with a dismissive sneer, as if my ownership was a temporary inconvenience she had graciously corrected. The rage inside me was a white-hot furnace, but my training held. You don't charge a machine gun nest head-on. You flank it. You gather intel. You choose your ground. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of sawdust and diesel filling my lungs. I looked past her, at the raw, open sky where a dense canopy of leaves had been just hours before. The silence was wrong. The birds were gone. The entire soundscape of my home had been erased. I looked back at her, my eyes locking onto hers, letting her see just a flicker of the cold fury I was holding in reserve. This wasn't over. This was the beginning. She had just declared a war she couldn't possibly comprehend, against a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting and winning them. She thought she had won a battle over landscaping. She had no idea she had just signed her own unconditional surrender. Before this story goes any further, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I want to hear from you, so drop a comment down below and let me know where you're watching from And if you have your own HOA nightmare story, I definitely want to hear about it. Now let me tell you how this all started. I bought the property 6 months prior, after 25 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. It was the culmination of a lifelong dream. The house itself was modest, a simple ranch-style place that was well built but needed some updating. But the house wasn't the prize. The prize was the land, specifically the 5 acres it sat on, and most specifically the 2 acres of that which constituted a stand of old-growth hardwoods. I'm not a sentimental man by nature, but those trees felt like history. They felt permanent. My realtor had explained that the property was technically part of the Oakwood Bluffs HOA, but it was one of the original homesteads that the development had been built around. The covenants, she assured me, were mostly about the newer, cookie-cutter houses in the main part of the subdivision. My property, she said, was largely left alone due to its unique nature. I had read the documents at closing, a thick stack of legalese that seemed to confirm it. There were rules about lawn height, fences, and paint colors, but it all seemed to apply to the tract homes. Nothing prepared me for the weaponized bureaucracy that was Karen Miller. My first encounter with her had been a week after I moved in. She'd shown up at my door, clipboard in hand, to welcome me to the neighborhood. It was less a welcome and more an interrogation. She'd pointed out that my temporary mailbox, the one the post office had provided, was not an approved model. She noted that the moving truck had left slight indentations on the grass verge by the street. She informed me that my plan to build a small workshop in the back would need to be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee, of which she was the chair, and that they rarely approved outbuildings of that nature. Every word was steeped in a condescending tone that implied I was a temporary guest in her personal kingdom, a guest who was already failing to meet her exacting standards. I had been polite but firm, assuring her I would get a permanent mailbox and that I would submit the plans as required, though I had already checked the county zoning for my specific lot, which permitted such a structure. I had dismissed her as a petty tyrant, a classic bored suburbanite with too much time and not enough real power. I had grievously underestimated my enemy. That was my first mistake. My second was assuming the rules would be applied with logic and fairness. Now, standing in the ruins of my sanctuary, holding her ridiculous invoice, I knew that this was not about rules. It was about control. It was about her demonstrating, in the most brutal way possible, that she held the power and I had none. She had to be shown, in no uncertain terms, just how wrong she was. My military training kicked in with the force of a reflex, overriding the initial shock and blinding rage. The first rule of engagement when you walk into an ambush is to get your head down, assess the situation, and start building a defensible position. Karen Miller was still yammering on about bylaws and community standards, her voice a grating drone against the backdrop of my silent, internal checklist. I folded the invoice she'd given me with crisp, precise movements and slid it into my back pocket. I needed to document everything, immediately, before a single piece of evidence could be disturbed. I met her gaze, my expression carefully neutral. "I will review the covenants, Karen," I said, my voice flat and devoid of the emotion that was churning in my gut. "You'll be hearing from me." Her face tightened, clearly disappointed by my lack of a screaming, explosive reaction. She wanted a fight, a scene, something she could use to paint me as an unhinged aggressor. I wasn't going to give it to her. I turned my back on her, a deliberate act of dismissal, and walked toward my front door. Inside the house, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my digital camera, a high-resolution DSLR I use for hobbies, and a small notebook. I walked back outside, starting at the street and working my way in, just as a forensics team would. I photographed the deep, muddy tracks left by the heavy machinery, showing clearly how they had veered off the public road and onto my property. I took wide shots of the entire devastated area, capturing the stark contrast between my remaining manicured lawn and the churned-up earth where the trees had been. Then I moved in closer. I took detailed photos of each and every stump, numbering them in my notebook as I went. I photographed the scattered debris, the piles of wood chips, the stray branches that had been carelessly flung against the side of my house. I used a tape measure for scale in many of the shots, documenting the diameter of the stumps, some of which were over 3 feet across. The whole time I could feel Karen watching me from her own porch across the street, her arms crossed, a look of sour disapproval on her face. Let her watch. Let her see the methodical, patient work of a man building a case brick by brick. An hour later, I had hundreds of photos and a notebook filled with meticulous observations. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, mournful shadows from the few remaining trees on the far side of my property. The emptiness of the sky was a physical ache. Back inside, I spread the HOA covenants and bylaws across my dining room table. It was the same thick stack of paper I'd skimmed at closing. This time, I read it word by word, line by line, with the focus of a man defusing a bomb. I was looking for Article 7, Section 4, the rule she had so confidently cited. I found Article 7, Landscaping and External Appearances. It went on for pages about approved shrubbery, lawn maintenance schedules, and the prohibition of garden gnomes. Finally, I found Section 4. It read, all lots must be maintained in a neat and orderly fashion. Overgrowth, dead foliage, and unkempt natural areas that are visible from the street or adjacent properties may be subject to remediation by the association at the homeowner's expense. It was there, in black and white. But it was vague, dangerously so. What constituted overgrowth or unkept? It was a subjective clause, and Karen had used that subjectivity as a weapon of mass destruction. But something felt wrong. The language seemed designed for the quarter-acre lots that made up the bulk of the subdivision, not for a 5-acre property that predated the development. I kept digging through the paperwork, past the primary declarations, into the addendums and amendments, and then I found it. Tucked away in a document titled Addendum C, Annexation of Homestead Lots 1 to 4, was a paragraph that made my pulse quicken. It stated with perfect legal clarity, notwithstanding any other provision in these covenants, Homestead Lots 1 to 4, as designated on the master plat, are exempt from aesthetic landscaping requirements pertaining to pre-existing, mature timber stands and natural woodland areas. These areas are recognized as integral to the historical character of the property. My lot was Homestead Lot 3. I read it again, and then a third time. It was a silver bullet, a kill shot. Karen hadn't just misinterpreted a rule. She had violated a specific legally binding exemption. She hadn't done me a favor. She had committed a flagrant act of illegal destruction and trespass. The next morning, I tried to contact the HOA board. I called the main number listed on their website, which went to a generic voicemail. I left a calm, detailed message requesting an immediate callback and citing Addendum C. I then composed a formal email, attaching a scanned copy of the addendum, and sent it to the official board email address. I requested a copy of the board meeting minutes where the remediation of my property was approved. I requested a copy of the contract with the tree removal company. I requested the names of the board members who had voted in favor of the action. For the rest of the day, there was only silence. No return call, no email reply. It was a classic bureaucratic stonewall, and I knew Karen was at the center of it, ensuring my requests disappeared into a black hole. That afternoon, I decided to do some reconnaissance on foot. I took a walk through the neighborhood, a friendly new guy getting some exercise. I struck up a conversation with an older gentleman tending his roses. When I mentioned the landscaping work on my property, he just shook his head. "That's Karen for you," he muttered, glancing around nervously. "She runs this place like it's her own little kingdom. Best not to cross her." A little further down the street, I saw a younger man, probably in his late 30s, washing his truck. This was Ben. He was less guarded. "Dude, I saw what they did. That's insane," he said, turning off the hose. "That woman is out of control. She fined me $200 last month because my kid's basketball hoop was 6 inches too close to the sidewalk." I told him I was trying to get some answers from the board. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Good luck. The rest of the board just does whatever she says. They're terrified of her. She gets them to approve stuff in these emergency email votes, so there's no public discussion. It's a sham." This was valuable intel. It confirmed my suspicion that Karen operated with impunity, likely by bullying the other board members. My final stop was an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived directly across from me, next door to Karen. She was frail, and her hands trembled as she watered her petunias. When she saw me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "Oh, you poor man," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw the trucks arrive yesterday. I wanted to call you, but I was afraid." She told me her husband had been on the board years ago, before he passed. "He tried to stand up to her," she said, her voice cracking. "She made his last years a misery. Fines, liens, constant letters. She broke his spirit." Mrs. Gable's fear was palpable, but in her eyes I saw a flicker of something else, a deep, abiding anger. She was a potential ally, but a deeply frightened one. I thanked her for her kindness and walked back to my house, the pieces clicking into place. This was a pattern. This was a systematic abuse of power. And the key to dismantling it wasn't just in the legal documents, it was in the community she terrorized. My mission was expanding. It wasn't just about getting justice for my trees anymore. It was about liberating an entire neighborhood. The next morning I drove to the county courthouse, a stately old brick building downtown. The sterile silence of the records room was a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of the past 2 days. This was my element: data, facts, and public records. I requested the master plat for the Oakwood Bluff subdivision and the complete file of all originally recorded HOA declarations and any subsequent amendments. The clerk, a kindly woman with glasses perched on her nose, wheeled out a heavy cart loaded with thick-bound volumes and dusty document folders. It was an analog treasure trove, a physical record that couldn't be deleted or hidden behind a 404 error page. I spent the next 4 hours poring over the documents, my fingers tracing the faded ink of property lines drawn 50 years ago. I confirmed what I already knew. My lot was clearly designated as Homestead Lot 3 on the official plat map. The annexation document, Addendum C, was there, properly recorded with the county, stamped and dated 22 years prior. It was an irrefutable legal fact. But I didn't stop there. I kept digging. I started cross-referencing the names of past and present board members, which were listed in the annual corporate filings the HOA was required to submit to the state. I made a list. Karen Miller, president for the last 12 consecutive years. Thomas Fletcher, treasurer. Maria Sanchez, secretary. 2 other names filled out the 5-member board. Then I pulled the business registration records for every landscaping and tree removal company in the county. I was looking for a connection, a link that would explain the sheer recklessness of the act. And then I found it. K&M Outdoor Solutions, LLC. The registered agent was a man named Martin Miller. A quick search on social media confirmed my suspicion. Martin Miller was Karen Miller's brother-in-law. My heart beat a little faster. This wasn't just a power trip anymore. It was a grift. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was creating business for her family. She had used her position as HOA president to authorize a no-bid contract with her own relative, paid for with community funds, to perform an illegal act. The conflict of interest was so blatant, so audacious, it was almost beautiful in its corruption. I photographed every relevant page with my phone. The plat map, Addendum C, the HOA corporate filings, the business registration for K&M Outdoor Solutions. I was building an arsenal of evidence, each document a perfectly machined round of ammunition. My next stop was to find a certified arborist. I didn't just want any guy with a chainsaw. I needed a forensic expert, someone whose testimony would stand up in court. I found a man named Dr. Alan Grant, a PhD in forestry management, who specialized in timber valuation and damage assessment. He agreed to meet me at my property that afternoon. Dr. Grant was a tall, weathered man with a quiet, academic demeanor. When he saw the field of stumps, he stopped dead in his tracks. He took off his hat and slowly shook his head, a look of profound sadness on his face. "My God," he murmured, "this is a massacre." He spent the next 3 hours conducting a meticulous survey. He took core samples from the stumps to verify their age and health. He identified each species: red oak, sugar maple, a few magnificent white ash that had somehow survived the emerald ash borer plague. He measured the diameter of every single stump, referencing a complex set of charts on his tablet. "These weren't just trees, Mr. Thompson," he explained, his voice tight with professional outrage. "These were specimen-grade hardwoods. The kind of trees that take a century to grow. You can't just go to a nursery and buy replacements. He explained the methodology for valuation, which wasn't just the board-foot value of the timber. The legal standard, he said, was the trunk formula method, a complex calculation involving the species, size, condition, and location of the tree. It calculated the cost of replacing the tree with the largest available nursery stock and factoring in the decades of lost growth. It also included the tree's functional value, shade, sound blocking, erosion control, and its aesthetic contribution to the property's overall value. He worked silently for a while, tapping numbers into his tablet, consulting his charts and making notes. Finally, he looked up, his expression grim. "I've completed a preliminary assessment," he said. "The oaks were the most valuable. Several of them were over 120 years old, perfectly healthy. The maples were in their prime. The ash trees were a tragedy in and of themselves." He took a deep breath. "Based on industry-standard valuation methods, which are admissible in court in this state, the total loss is substantial." He paused as if to brace me for the number. "I'm estimating the combined replacement and timber theft value at approximately $890,000. The figure hung in the air, immense and solid. $890,000. It wasn't an emotional number or a negotiating tactic. It was a cold, hard, calculated value based on science and legal precedent. Karen hadn't just cleared some messy trees. She had presided over the destruction of a treasure, an asset worth nearly $1 million, and she had done it for a $3,500 contract for her brother-in-law. The fine she'd tried to levy against me was a rounding error in the face of the actual damage. I looked at the field of stumps, then back at the arborist. The path forward was now crystal clear. The initial fog of war had lifted, revealing the enemy's precise location, strength, and weakness. It was time to call in the heavy artillery, armed with a digital folder overflowing with evidence, high-resolution photos, scanned county records, the damning business registration of K&M Outdoor Solutions, and Dr. Grant's preliminary valuation. I knew my next step required a professional. This was no longer a DIY project. This was a legal campaign, and I needed a commanding officer. I spent the evening researching property law attorneys in the state capitol. I wasn't looking for the biggest firm or the one with the flashiest television commercials. I was looking for a shark, a specialist who knew how to dismantle corrupt HOAs. I found her on the third page of my search results. Sarah Jenkins of Jenkins & Associates. Her bio was concise and formidable. 20 years of experience in real estate and contract litigation, with a notable list of successful, high-judgment cases against homeowners associations. The final line of her bio caught my eye. Daughter of a proud U.S. Marine. I called her office first thing in the morning. I didn't get a paralegal or a receptionist. She answered the phone herself. Sarah Jenkins. Her voice was sharp, efficient, and had an unmistakable edge of no-nonsense authority. I gave her the 30-second version of my story. Retired Army engineer, new property, illegal destruction of nearly $1 million worth of protected timber by an HOA president who hired her brother-in-law for the job. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice now carrying a distinct note of interest, "can you be in my office at 1400 hours today?" I arrived at her office, a modest but impeccably organized suite in a downtown high-rise, at 1355. Sarah Jenkins was exactly as I had pictured. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an aura of intense focus. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Show me what you have," she said, gesturing to the large conference table. For the next hour, I laid out my case. I connected my laptop to her large monitor and walked her through the evidence, folder by folder. The photos of the destruction, the video walkthrough, the meticulously labeled images of each stump. I showed her the county plat map with my lot clearly marked, the recorded copy of Addendum C with the exemption clause highlighted. Then I brought up the corporate filings for the HOA next to the business registration for K&M Outdoor Solutions, the names Miller shining like a corrupt beacon. Finally, I showed her the email from Dr. Grant with the preliminary valuation of $890,000. She listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on the screen, occasionally jotting down a note on a yellow legal pad. Her expression was unreadable, a professional poker face honed by years of litigation. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers, her gaze still on the evidence. She was silent for a long moment, and the quiet in the room was heavy with intellectual force. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "This is not a case. This is a work of art. The thoroughness of your documentation is extraordinary. You've done 90% of my job for me." She stood up and began to pace, the energy in the room shifting from analytical to predatory. "This isn't just a simple suit for damages. This is a multi-front war. First, we sue the HOA for trespass and destruction of property. Our state has a timber trespass statute that allows for treble damages. That means we don't sue for $890,000. We sue for $2.67 million. That's our opening bid." My eyebrows shot up. She held up a hand. "That's just the beginning. Second, we file a suit against the board of directors personally, Karen Miller, and every single member who voted for this, for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. Their directors' and officers' insurance policy will likely have a clause that voids coverage in cases of willful misconduct or illegal acts. We're going to put their personal assets in the crosshairs. That gets their attention." She pointed at the screen showing the K&M Outdoor Solutions registration. "Third, we file a formal complaint with the state's attorney general and the licensing board regarding the conflict of interest and potential fraud. We will subpoena the contract, the invoices, the payment records. We will find out if her brother-in-law's company was even licensed and insured for this kind of large-scale tree removal. I'm betting they weren't." She stopped pacing and looked directly at me. "Karen Miller made two critical mistakes. First, she underestimated you. She saw a new resident and assumed you were an easy target. Second, she got greedy and sloppy. The conflict of interest with her brother-in-law is the pivot point on which their entire defense will collapse. She didn't just break the rules, she did it for personal gain, and she created a paper trail." She explained the strategy. They would start with a brutal, comprehensive demand letter. It wouldn't be a polite request. It would be a legal broadside, a declaration of war that would land on the desk of the HOA's insurance carrier with the force of a bomb. "The insurance company is the real target here," Sarah explained. "They don't care about Karen's feelings or her little kingdom. They care about money. When they see the strength of our evidence, the recorded covenant, the arborist's report, the blatant conflict of interest, they will see a multi-million-dollar liability on their books caused by a rogue board president. Their first move will be to force a settlement to mitigate their losses. They will throw Karen and the board under the bus to save themselves." The clarity and ruthlessness of the plan were breathtaking. It was a perfect flanking maneuver, targeting the enemy's supply lines, the insurance policy, and their command structure. I hired her on the spot. As I was leaving her office, she shook my hand firmly. "My father always said, don't start a fight, but if you're in one, you make damn sure you finish it. You've got a hell of a fight on your hands, Mr. Thompson, but we're going to finish it." I walked out of that building feeling something I hadn't felt since the destruction. Hope. Not just hope, but the cold, hard certainty of impending victory. The game had changed. I was no longer a lone homeowner fighting a bureaucracy. I was a client, and I had just unleashed a weapon of legal mass destruction named Sarah Jenkins. Karen Miller had no idea what was coming. 2 days later, the first salvo was fired. Sarah drafted a 16-page demand letter that was a masterpiece of legal aggression. It was addressed to the HOA Board of Directors, care of President Karen Miller, but it was also CC'd directly to the legal departments of the HOA's insurance carrier and the management company. The letter began by formally documenting the date and nature of the trespass and the destruction of 48 protected mature trees. It then systematically dismantled any possible defense. It cited Addendum C, Section 2 of the Recorded Covenants, proving the trees were exempt. It included the full notarized report from Dr. Grant, the arborist, detailing the species, age, and condition of every single tree, culminating in the $890,000 valuation. It referenced the state's timber trespass statute in the demand for treble damages, putting the total claim at $2,670,000. Then came the kill shot. The letter detailed the blatant conflict of interest, naming K&M Outdoor Solutions and its connection to Karen Miller. It formally accused the board of breach of fiduciary duty, gross negligence, and potential conspiracy to commit fraud. It concluded with a stark demand: full payment of the $890,000 base damages, plus all legal fees incurred to date, to be paid within 14 business days. If the demand was not met, a lawsuit would be filed for the full $2.67 million against the HOA and against each board member individually. We sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested, creating an undeniable record that it had been received. The green receipt card, signed by Karen Miller herself, came back to Sarah's office 3 days later. It was like the pin had been pulled from a grenade. The ensuing explosion was not what I expected. I had anticipated a panicked call from the HOA's lawyer or their insurance company. Instead, there was only silence from them. The reaction came directly from Karen, and it was one of pure, undiluted rage. She saw the letter not as the grave legal threat it was, but as a personal insult, a challenge to her sovereignty. Her retaliation was petty, swift, and utterly predictable. It began the following Saturday. I received my first official notice of violation in the mail. It was a crisp, computer-printed form with a photograph attached. My crime? My trash receptacle had been placed at the curb with its wheels facing the street, instead of facing the house, a violation of a newly minted rule apparently passed by emergency board resolution. The fine was $50. 3 days later, another notice arrived. This one was for improper lawn maintenance. The attached photo showed a single defiant dandelion blooming near my driveway. The fine was $75. A week after that, a notice for my mailbox. Despite having replaced the temporary one with a handsome, sturdy postmaster-approved model, it was apparently non-compliant. The color, a standard forest green, was not on the approved palette of beige, black, or white. The fine was $150 with a demand to repaint it within 10 days. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, a campaign of harassment designed to annoy, intimidate, and bleed me dry with petty fines. Karen was doubling down. She was trying to prove that she was still in charge, that her power over the minutiae of my life was absolute, regardless of the multi-million-dollar lawsuit looming over her head. She completely failed to understand that every single one of these retaliatory notices was another nail in her own coffin. I carefully scanned each notice, each photograph, each envelope with its postmark, and forwarded them to Sarah. "This is wonderful," she said over the phone, a note of genuine delight in her voice. "This is textbook harassment and retaliation. She's creating a documented pattern of behavior that proves malice. Keep them coming." Karen then escalated her campaign to the social front. The neighborhood had a private Facebook group which she administered with an iron fist. A post appeared from her, a long, rambling screed about new residents who don't respect our community's values. She didn't name me, but the implication was clear. She wrote about frivolous legal threats designed to bankrupt our association and force a massive special assessment on every single one of you. She painted herself as the valiant defender of the community's finances, standing firm against a greedy, litigious outsider. The comment section quickly filled with a mix of her loyal sycophants offering their support and other more nervous residents asking worried questions about a special assessment. She was trying to isolate me to turn my future allies against me before I could even speak to them. It was a classic smear campaign, and for a few days it seemed to be working. I'd get cold shoulders when I went to check the mail, suspicious glances from people driving by. She was poisoning the well, using fear to maintain control. But her strategy had a fatal flaw. By threatening everyone with a special assessment, she was making my problem their problem. She thought it would unite them against me. She had no idea it was about to unite them with me. The pressure she was applying wasn't just on me anymore. It was on the entire neighborhood, and that pressure was building toward a breaking point. Karen's strategy of weaponizing fear and social pressure began to fray at the edges, creating cracks in the very foundation of her power. Her overreach was the catalyst. One evening there was a knock on my door. It was Ben, the younger neighbor I'd spoken with while he was washing his truck. He looked frustrated and angry. In his hand, he held a sheaf of papers. "She's lost her mind," he said. stepping inside and spreading the papers on my dining room table. They were violation notices, just like mine. One was for his son's bicycle being left on the lawn for 2 hours. Another was for a small oil stain on his driveway, no bigger than a quarter. The third and most ridiculous was for having unapproved holiday lighting because his wife had put up a string of decorative solar-powered fairy lights around their patio. The fines totaled over $400. "I've lived here for 6 years, Mark," he said, his voice tight. "Never had a single violation. I make one comment in that Facebook group asking what the lawsuit is actually about, and suddenly I'm the worst homeowner in the neighborhood. This is retaliation, plain and simple." I showed him my own growing stack of fines. He whistled. "She's trying to bully us into silence." That was the moment the resistance began to coalesce. We weren't just two disgruntled neighbors anymore. We were two soldiers in the same trench. We spent the next 2 hours talking, comparing notes, and forming a plan. We needed more people. We needed more evidence. We needed to build an alliance. The next day, Ben and I started talking to people, but not in a public forum. We did it quietly, one-on-one. We identified homeowners who had previously expressed frustration with Karen or who had been on the receiving end of her petty tyranny. Our biggest breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Gable, the elderly, fearful woman from across the street, saw me and Ben talking in my driveway. She watched us for a long time from her window. Finally, her front door opened, and she slowly, hesitantly walked across the street. She was clutching a large, dusty accordion file to her chest as if it were a precious artifact. "My Charles," she began, her voice trembling. "He always said she was crooked. He tried to fight her from inside the board, but he was always outvoted. After he passed, I put all his old files away. I was afraid to even look at them." She held out the file to me. "I heard what she's doing to you and to young Ben here. It's not right. Charles would have wanted you to have this." We took her inside and opened the file on the table. It was a treasure trove, a meticulously kept record of Karen's reign. My late neighbor, Charles Gable, had been a quiet but diligent bookkeeper. The file contained years of HOA financial statements, board meeting minutes that were never released to the public, and handwritten notes detailing suspicious activities. We found evidence that Karen had repeatedly used the emergency email vote procedure Ben had mentioned to approve non-emergency expenditures, bypassing public discussion. The pattern was always the same: a vague proposal, a quick 3-2 vote with her two loyalists, and an approved contract. Most damningly, we found a series of invoices from K&M Outdoor Solutions stretching back 5 years. There were contracts for lawn aeration, sprinkler repair, fence mending, and gutter cleaning. The total amount paid to her brother-in-law's company over the years was staggering, well into the 6 figures. Charles had made notes in the margins. No other bids sought. Invoice seems high for work performed. KM pushed this through. He had also uncovered a section of the original bylaws, long since updated and removed from the public versions Karen distributed, that explicitly required a minimum of 3 competitive bids for any non-emergency expenditure over $5,000. Karen had violated this rule dozens of times. This was the smoking gun. This wasn't just a conflict of interest. It was a long-term, systematic scheme to funnel HOA funds to her family. The destruction of my trees was simply the most brazen and destructive example of a deeply ingrained pattern of corruption. With this new evidence, our small alliance grew bolder. Ben and I, along with 2 other homeowners who had been targeted by Karen in the past, formed what we called the Oakwood Bluffs Concerned Homeowners Committee. We set up a private, secure email group, excluding anyone we knew to be a Karen loyalist. We held a secret meeting in Ben's basement, the air thick with the smell of laundry detergent and righteous indignation. One by one, people shared their stories. A single mom who was fined for her children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. A family who was denied a request to build a wheelchair ramp for their aging parent because it didn't match the community aesthetic. An army of people who had been bullied, fined, and intimidated into silence. We scanned every document from Mrs. Gable's file, creating a digital archive of Karen's corruption. We cross-referenced the invoices with our own violation notices, building a timeline that showed a clear pattern. Anyone who questioned Karen's authority or financial decisions was immediately targeted with a flurry of fines. We were no longer just a small group of victims. We were an organized, evidence-based opposition. Karen thought she was fighting a war on one front, against me. She had no idea that a full-blown insurgency was gathering strength right under her nose, preparing to open a second front that would strike at the very heart of her authority. The annual HOA meeting was just 3 weeks away. It was meant to be her stage, her yearly coronation. We were going to make it her trial. The invitation for the Oakwood Bluffs HOA annual general meeting arrived in the mail, printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, as if it were an invitation to a royal gala. The meeting was to be held in the clubhouse, a sterile beige room that served as Karen's seat of power. The agenda set by Karen was predictable: a welcome address from the president, a review of the year's accomplishments, a treasurer's report, and a vote on the new budget. Tucked near the end, under new business, was an item that made my blood run cold: discussion and vote on a proposed special assessment to cover unforeseen legal defense expenditures. She was going to do it. She was going to stand in front of the entire community, paint me as the villain, and ask my neighbors to pay for the privilege of fighting me in court. It was a bold, arrogant move, and it was going to be her undoing. Our committee had been working tirelessly. We had drafted our own information packets, each one containing a concise summary of our findings. We included a copy of Addendum C, a timeline of Karen's conflict of interest dealings with her brother-in-law, examples of the retaliatory fines, and a clear explanation of how Karen's actions, not my lawsuit, were the true source of the HOA's legal and financial peril. Sarah Jenkins had coached me extensively. "Don't show your hand too early," she advised. "Let her walk right into the trap. She'll be overconfident. She'll control the microphone and the agenda. You have to use the rules of the meeting against her. Wait for the new business section. Every homeowner has a right to be heard. That's your opening." The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. More people had shown up than in any previous year, a testament to the undercurrent of anxiety Karen's Facebook posts had created. Karen was at a podium at the front of the room, beaming, flanked by her two loyalist board members, Thomas Fletcher and Maria Sanchez. The other two board members looked distinctly uncomfortable, sitting slightly apart from the main group. I took a seat in the back with Ben and the other members of our committee. Sarah Jenkins was also there, dressed not as a lawyer, but as a concerned resident, sitting quietly by herself near the side exit. She gave me a subtle, confident nod. Karen began the meeting with a saccharine speech about community and shared values. She presented a slideshow of freshly mulched flower beds and newly painted fences, her accomplishments. When the treasurer, Thomas Fletcher, gave his report, he nervously glossed over the line item for grounds maintenance, which had mysteriously ballooned by 30% that year. Finally, the moment arrived. "And now," Karen announced, her voice dripping with faux solemnity, "we must address a difficult matter. As some of you know, the board has been forced to retain legal counsel to defend our community against an aggressive and frivolous lawsuit from a resident. To cover these unforeseen costs, the board proposes a one-time special assessment of $500 per household." A wave of murmurs and anxious whispers swept through the room. People looked at each other, then at me. This was her moment of public shaming. "Is there any discussion?" Karen asked, her eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to object. This was my cue. I stood up. "I have a question," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the suddenly silent room. Every head turned toward me. Karen's smile tightened. "Mr. Thompson, of course. Please keep it brief." "I'd like to propose we discuss the root cause of these unforeseen legal expenditures before we vote on forcing the homeowners to pay for them," I said. I held up a remote for a projector I had discreetly set up in the back. Before Karen could object, I clicked the button. The first image that flashed onto the large screen behind her was a panoramic shot of the wasteland she had made of my property. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "This," I said, "is what the legal expenditure is about. This was my property 3 weeks ago." I clicked again, showing a before picture, a beautiful, lush wall of green. I then walked the entire room through the evidence. I projected the image of Addendum C, highlighting the exemption clause. I read it aloud. I projected the arborist's report, the $890,000 valuation clear for all to see. I showed them the timber trespass statute and the $2.67 million demand. The mood in the room shifted from anxious murmuring to stunned silence. This lawsuit isn't frivolous, I continued, my voice gaining strength. It's the direct result of the board, led by President Miller, taking illegal action on private property, and the core reason for this action appears to be financial. I clicked again. The business registration for K&M Outdoor Solutions appeared on the screen next to a smiling family photo of Karen and her brother-in-law downloaded from his public Facebook page. The connection was undeniable. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions. Karen's face had gone from smug to ashen. She banged her gavel. "This is out of order. This is a private matter." But it was too late. Ben stood up. "It's not a private matter when our money is being used to pay her relatives. I have copies of 5 years of invoices paid to this company, with no competing bids, in direct violation of our bylaws." Another homeowner, a woman from our committee, stood up. "And it's not a private matter when she uses fines to silence people. She's fined me 3 times since I questioned the landscaping budget." One by one, members of our committee stood up, their voices joining in a chorus of dissent, each one presenting another piece of the puzzle. We handed out our information packets. Homeowners were grabbing them, reading them with shocked expressions, the truth spreading through the room like wildfire. Karen, utterly losing control, just kept banging her gavel, her face a mask of fury and panic. The public confrontation was a success beyond my wildest dreams. We hadn't just presented my case. We had exposed the entire rotten system she had built. Her power, which was rooted in controlling the flow of information and intimidating dissenters, was evaporating before our very eyes. The stage she had built for my humiliation had become the scene of her own public indictment. The chaos in the clubhouse was absolute. Homeowners were shouting, waving the information packets we distributed, demanding answers from the pale-faced board members. Karen was screaming for order, but her authority was gone, shattered by the weight of the evidence projected on the screen behind her. Sitting near the front, looking utterly shell-shocked, were 2 men in suits I hadn't recognized before. One was the HOA's longtime lawyer, a local attorney named Bill Peterson, who clearly handled more real estate closings than contentious litigation. The other, a man with a severe expression and the aura of someone who calculates risk for a living, was the representative from the HOA's insurance carrier, a Mr. Hayes. Both had been invited by Karen, presumably to lend gravity to her demand for special assessment. Now they looked like men who had just watched their ship sail directly into an iceberg. As the uproar reached its peak, a calm, commanding voice cut through the noise. "Perhaps I can shed some light on the legal and financial ramifications of this situation." All eyes turned to the side of the room. Sarah Jenkins stood up, her posture radiating a confidence that instantly silenced the crowd. She walked calmly to the front of the room, standing not at the podium, but to the side, as if addressing a jury. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she began. "I am the attorney representing Mr. Thompson. I'm also the attorney who sent this board a detailed 16-page demand letter 3 weeks ago, a letter which they clearly ignored." She turned her gaze on the HOA's lawyer, Peterson. "Mr. Peterson, did the board forward you a copy of my letter? Did they inform you that they were being accused of trespass, timber theft under a treble damages statute, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit fraud through a conflict of interest scheme?" Peterson stammered, shuffling his papers. I was informed there was a dispute." "A dispute?" Sarah's voice was laced with ice. "A demand for $2.67 million is not a dispute. It's a declaration of catastrophic liability. And instead of seeking legal counsel and mitigating the damage, your client, President Miller, chose to engage in a documented campaign of harassment and retaliation against my client." She gestured to the pile of violation notices on the front table, all of which, I might add, constitutes evidence of malice, which will be extremely compelling to a jury and may open the door to punitive damages beyond the statutory timber penalties. She then turned her attention to the insurance representative, Mr. Hayes. Her tone softened slightly, but the message was just as brutal. "Mr. Hayes, your company provides the directors and officers liability policy for this association. I'm sure you're aware that most D&O policies contain an exclusion for acts involving illegal conduct, fraud, or personal enrichment. Given the overwhelming evidence presented tonight of a multi-year conflict of interest scheme benefiting the president's family and the execution of a verifiably illegal act in direct violation of recorded covenants, I'd say you have a very strong case for denying this claim entirely. The color drained from the faces of the other four board members. The implication was terrifyingly clear. If the insurance company denied the claim, the multi-million-dollar judgment would fall not just on the HOA as a whole, but potentially on them personally. Their personal homes, savings, and retirement accounts were now on the line because they had blindly followed Karen's lead. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice resonating with finality, by ignoring our initial offer to settle for the base damages of $890,000 and instead choosing this path of escalation, the board has acted in bad faith. That offer is now permanently off the table. We will be filing suit for the full amount, plus punitive damages and all legal fees, on Monday morning. The legal trap had been sprung, and it was devastatingly effective. Sarah had not only validated my claims in a public forum, but had also driven a wedge between the board members, their lawyer, and their insurance carrier. The alliance of corruption had been shattered in less than 10 minutes. One of the board members, Maria Sanchez, the secretary, suddenly stood up, her voice shaking. I want it on the record that I voted against the tree removal. Karen told us it was an emergency vote and that the homeowner had been notified and had agreed. Karen whirled on her. You liar, you voted yes with everyone else. Only because you told us it was all legal. The treasurer, Thomas Fletcher, chimed in, sweat beading on his forehead. You said you had checked the covenants. The board was cannibalizing itself, live and in public. Each member was scrambling to distance themselves from Karen, desperately trying to avoid the liability that was now hurtling toward them. Mr. Hayes, the insurance man, stood up and quietly excused himself, walking out of the room while speaking urgently into his phone. The HOA's lawyer, Peterson, looked at Karen with a mixture of fury and despair. Karen, you told me this was a simple covenant violation, he hissed, his voice just loud enough for the front rows to hear. The meeting was over. The vote on the special assessment never happened. The homeowners, now armed with the truth, were coalescing around me and my committee, their anger redirected from me to the woman at the podium. Karen stood alone, her gavel useless, her face a thunderous mask of disbelief. She had walked into her own coronation and found herself at her own execution. The trap had not only sprung, it had snapped shut with lethal force. The days following the annual meeting were a blur of frantic activity for the HOA board and a period of watchful waiting for me. The bomb Sarah Jenkins had detonated in that clubhouse sent shockwaves through the entire structure of Karen's little kingdom. The first and most immediate consequence was a letter that arrived via courier at Karen's house, with copies sent to every other board member. It was from Mr. Hayes' insurance company. It was a reservation of rights letter, a piece of legal jargon with a very simple and brutal meaning. We think you, the board, acted so negligently and potentially illegally that we probably don't have to cover your losses. We will provide a lawyer for now, but we reserve the right to deny the claim and even sue you to recover our costs if our investigation proves willful misconduct. The safety net was gone. The board members were now staring into a financial abyss, personally exposed to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. Their loyalty to Karen, which was always based on fear and complacency, evaporated overnight. An emergency board meeting was called 2 days after the disastrous AGM. I wasn't present, but Ben, whose house was next to the clubhouse, told me he could hear the shouting from his backyard. According to the official minutes, which were leaked to our committee by a now desperate Maria Sanchez, the meeting was a bloodbath. The other four board members, led by their new, very expensive lawyer provided by the insurance company, confronted Karen with the evidence from Mrs. Gable's file, the no-bid contracts, the doctored minutes, the history of financial malfeasance. They formally accused her of misleading the board and knowingly exposing them all to massive personal liability. The vote was 4-1. Karen Miller was removed from her position as president of the Oakwood Bluffs HOA, effective immediately, for gross negligence, malfeasance, and breach of fiduciary duty. While her internal power structure was collapsing, our Concerned Homeowners Committee was consolidating its power. We used the momentum from the AGM to launch an official petition to recall the entire remaining board. The bylaws required signatures from 25% of the homeowners to force a special election. We had them in less than 48 hours. People were lining up in Ben's driveway to sign, their anger at years of petty tyranny finally boiling over. Faced with a recall, they knew they couldn't survive, and under immense pressure from their new lawyer to mitigate the damage, the now leaderless board instructed their attorney to contact Sarah Jenkins and surrender. The settlement negotiation was less a negotiation and more a capitulation. Sarah, in a position of absolute strength, dictated the terms. The HOA's insurance carrier, desperate to avoid a public trial and a verdict that could climb even higher with punitive damages, agreed to pay the full base valuation of the trees, $890,000. The check was to be made out directly to me. Furthermore, the HOA itself, not the insurance company, would be responsible for paying 100% of my legal fees, which Sarah had meticulously documented. And in a final beautiful turn of the screw, Sarah used a clause from the old bylaws Mrs. Gable had saved, a clause about personal liability for board members in cases of proven conflict of interest, to force the HOA to personally fine Karen Miller. The fine was calculated based on the total value of the illegal contract she had given her brother-in-law, plus penalties. It came to just over $25,000. Karen's downfall was swift and total. She was stripped of her title. She was facing a massive personal fine from the very organization she used to control, and her troubles were just beginning. The new interim board, eager to demonstrate its reformist credentials, immediately terminated all contracts with K&M Outdoor Solutions. They then forwarded the entire file of evidence our committee had compiled, the invoices, the meeting minutes, the conflict of interest documentation, to the state's attorney general and the contractor licensing board. Karen's brother-in-law was now facing a state investigation that could cost him his business license and potentially lead to criminal charges for fraud. To top it all off, the insurance carrier, after paying out the settlement to me, promptly filed a lawsuit against both Karen and her brother-in-law's company to recoup their losses, alleging collusion and fraud. One afternoon about a month after the AGM, a large cashier's check for $890,000 arrived at Sarah's office. She called me immediately. "The eagle has landed, Mr. Thompson," she said, a deep satisfaction in her voice. I drove to her office and picked it up. I remember just holding it in my hands, looking at the number. It wasn't a jackpot. It didn't feel like a victory, not yet. It felt like restitution. It was the cold, hard number that represented the ghost of a forest, a receipt for a crime. The real victory was yet to come. The special election was held and it was a clean sweep. I was reluctantly elected as the new HOA president, with Ben as vice president and 3 other reform-minded homeowners from our committee filling out the new board. Karen Miller was now just another resident, stripped of all power, awaiting the avalanche of legal and financial consequences she had brought upon herself. My first act as the new HOA president was to call a meeting of the new board. We gathered not in the sterile clubhouse, but on my back porch, overlooking the field of stumps that had started it all. The mood was sober, determined. We weren't there to celebrate. We were there to work, to dismantle the machinery of tyranny and rebuild it into something fair and transparent. Our first official vote was unanimous. We hired an independent, third-party auditing firm to conduct a complete forensic audit of the HOA's finances going back 12 years, the full length of Karen's presidency. We wanted to uncover every dollar that had been misspent, every contract that had been improperly awarded. Our second act was to form a bylaw review committee composed of homeowners from all corners of the neighborhood. Their mission was to rewrite our governing documents from the ground up, embedding principles of transparency, accountability, and fairness into their very DNA. We proposed term limits for all board members, strict rules on competitive bidding for all contracts, an end to secret, emergency votes, and the creation of a simple, independent appeals process for fines and violations. We were transforming the HOA from a weapon of control into a tool for genuine community management. The symbolic final confrontation with Karen was not the dramatic showdown I might have once imagined. It was quiet, mundane, and all the more satisfying for it. About 2 months after the settlement, a for sale sign appeared on Karen's lawn. The combination of the $25,000 fine from the HOA, her own mounting legal fees to defend herself against the insurance company's lawsuit, and the public disgrace had made her position in the neighborhood untenable. One Saturday morning, I was out in my yard, planning the first phase of my replanting project, when a large moving truck pulled up to her house. I watched from a distance as she and her husband directed the movers, their faces grim, their movements heavy with defeat. She saw me standing there, across the street on the edge of my property. Our eyes met for a moment. There was no smugness left in her gaze, no fire of defiance. There was only a hollow, bitter resentment. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat or wave. I just gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of greeting or forgiveness. It was a nod of finality. A quiet acknowledgement that the battle was over, the accounts were settled, and justice, in its slow, grinding way, had been served. She quickly looked away and disappeared inside her house. I never saw her again. The money from the settlement felt like a heavy responsibility. It was never about getting rich. It was about making things right. After paying Sarah's magnificent fee and setting aside a significant portion for my own property's restoration, I still had a substantial amount left over. With the new board's approval, I used $100,000 of it to establish the Oakwood Bluffs Community Fund. It was an endowment managed by the new transparent board, designed to provide small grants to homeowners facing legitimate financial hardship who needed help with critical repairs to stay in compliance with community standards. It was a safety net, the polar opposite of Karen's punitive fine system. It was designed to help people, not punish them. The rest of the money went into my land. I didn't try to buy impossibly large, mature trees to instantly replace what was lost. That felt wrong, like trying to fake history. Instead, I worked with Dr. Grant, the arborist, to develop a long-term reforestation plan. We brought in hundreds of saplings, native red oaks, sugar maples, white pines, and even some disease-resistant American elms. I spent weeks working the soil, digging holes, and carefully planting each one. My neighbors, the very people Karen had tried to turn against me, came to help. Ben brought his kids. Mrs. Gable directed the placement of a beautiful dogwood near the road. Others brought shovels, water, and food. We turned the site of a crime into a community project. We were not just planting trees, we were planting new roots for the entire neighborhood. Months later, standing on my property line, I looked out at the field of young, hopeful trees, each one protected by a small stake and wire, reaching for the sun. The air was quiet, peaceful. The birds were starting to come back. The community felt different. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership and mutual respect. I had won the money, yes, but the real victory wasn't the number on the check. It was the feeling of standing in the quiet evening air, looking at the future I had helped plant, knowing that a petty tyrant had been deposed, a community had been liberated, and justice, hard-won and deeply satisfying, had finally taken root.